Snoop Dogg had been through plenty of wild situations in his life. Fame had a way of putting a target on your back, but nothing annoyed him more than being falsely accused of something he had absolutely nothing to do with. It was just another laid-back afternoon, another city, another upscale boutique he was casually passing through, minding his own business. The store had that unmistakable scent of wealth, glass display cases, overpriced designer goods, and staff who either catered to customers with excessive enthusiasm or scrutinized them suspiciously, depending on who they believed had real money. Snoop was browsing at his own pace, nodding along to the rhythm of a song playing in his head, when a sharp voice suddenly cut through the air. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." He turned slowly, his expression concealed behind his signature shades, only to see a store manager, red-faced and visibly agitated, striding toward him with the determination of someone who thought they had just caught a criminal in the act. "I need to check your pockets. We have reason to believe you've taken something." "Here we go again." Snoop Dogg had been in this situation before, too many times. The feeling of being watched too closely, judged before a single word was spoken, treated like a suspect just for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But this time, they had really tried it. The boutique was high-end, the kind of place where the air itself smelled expensive, where the walls were lined with shelves displaying designer watches, gold-plated accessories, and silk-lined handbags that cost more than most people's rent. The customers here weren't in a rush, they strolled through like they belonged, sipping complimentary champagne, chatting softly, their diamond-studded fingers grazing price tags like numbers didn't matter. Snoop had only stepped in because he was waiting on a meeting nearby, figured he'd kill some time checking out some new drip. He wasn't even shopping heavy, just vibing, nodding along to a melody in his head while casually glancing over a few watches in a glass display case. Then came the voice. Sharp. Accusatory. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." It wasn't a request. The moment the store manager's sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the air, everything else in the boutique seemed to freeze, as if time itself had paused just to focus on the accusation that had just been thrown into the open. The faint hum of soft jazz playing through the store's speakers suddenly felt distant, irrelevant, overshadowed by the thick tension that settled in the space like a dense fog. The customers, who had been mindlessly browsing through shelves of designer handbags and overpriced accessories, now found themselves caught in an invisible crossroads, torn between pretending they weren't paying attention and indulging in their curiosity, their heads subtly turning toward the scene, their conversations dying down to hushed murmurs as they watched the unfolding drama. Snoop Dogg, standing there in the middle of the store, hadn't moved an inch. He didn't need to. He had been in this position before, had felt the weight of an entire room shifting against him without warning, had seen the way judgment worked before a single fact had been laid out. But this time, there was something different in the air, something colder, something heavier, something that felt less like an inconvenience and more like a challenge. And if that's what it was, then the manager had just made a huge mistake. The woman, dressed in a perfectly tailored blazer and a name tag that was polished to perfection, made her way toward Snoop with the kind of stiff-backed confidence that only came from someone who had spent too much time believing they were always right. Her heels clicked against the pristine marble floors with each step, her shoulders squared, her expression firm, not quite angry, but laced with absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that could turn into embarrassment in an instant if she wasn't careful. Snoop didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't even shift his weight. Because this wasn't his moment to react. This was her moment to prove just how wrong she was. The manager stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, hesitation flickered in her eyes. Maybe it was because she was close enough now to really take in the details, the casual but expensive outfit, the signature shades, the quiet confidence in the way Snoop carried himself, like a man who had nothing to prove but knew he owned the space he stood in. Maybe, for a fleeting second, she started to doubt herself, started to question whether she was about to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. But ego? Ego never backed down that easy. "Sir, I need you to stop right there," she repeated, her voice still laced with authority but now carrying a trace of something she hadn't expected, uncertainty. Snoop let a slow exhale slip through his nose, still keeping his expression neutral behind his shades. He had seen this exact scene play out too many times to count, the way people assumed before they thought, the way they accused before they understood, the way they felt emboldened when they thought they had the power. But the thing about power? It only belonged to the ones who truly knew how to hold it. "We need to check your pockets," the manager continued, adjusting the clipboard in her arms, her fingers gripping it a little tighter now, as if she could feel the tension mounting in the room. "We have reason to believe you've taken something." And there it was. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, like a slap across the face of logic itself. Snoop Dogg, a man wearing more jewelry than the glass cases in the store combined, a man who had walked in casually, unbothered, not even carrying a shopping bag, was somehow their number one suspect. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it wasn't so damn predictable. Around the store, the other shoppers exchanged looks, some of them awkward, some of them clearly recognizing Snoop but choosing to stay silent, knowing exactly what was happening but not wanting to be the ones to call it out. A man in a tailored suit near the watches section cleared his throat and looked away. A woman pretending to be engrossed in a row of handbags stole a glance at the situation, her grip tightening on the strap of her purse. Even the cashier, a younger woman who had been scanning a sale, froze mid-motion, her hand hovering over the register as she tried to decide whether she should step in or keep pretending this was none of her business. And that was always the part that hit the hardest. Not the accusation itself, but the silence that followed. The silence of people who knew it was wrong but decided to let it happen anyway. At the entrance, the security guard, a broad-shouldered man who looked like he had been hired for intimidation rather than customer service, was already shifting his weight, already scanning the scene like he was preparing to make a move. He wasn't just there to watch, he was waiting for the signal, for the moment when the manager decided she wanted backup, for the second when he could step forward and turn a false accusation into a real confrontation. Snoop noticed him without even turning his head. Noted the stance. Noted the way his hand twitched near his belt, like he was hoping, that this would escalate just enough to justify his presence. And that was almost the worst part of all. Because this wasn't about whether Snoop had stolen anything. It was about the fact that they had already decided he had before he even had the chance to prove them wrong. Snoop finally moved. Not fast. Not aggressively. Just slowly, removing his shades, lowering them just enough so the manager could see exactly who she was talking to, so there would be no excuses later, so she would have to live with the memory of the moment she realized she had just accused the wrong one. He let the silence stretch a little longer. Let the weight of her mistake settle. And then, when he knew she was starting to feel it, when he could see the flicker of regret beginning to take shape behind her forced confidence, he finally spoke. "You sure you want to do this?" The manager blinked. She hesitated. For the first time, her polished, overconfident demeanor cracked, just slightly, just enough for the doubt to seep in. Because now, she wasn't sure if she was looking at a suspect. Or a mistake she couldn't take back. The weight of the moment didn't just fall on her, it fell on everyone. The customers. The employees. The security guard. Because now, everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. And deep down, they already knew. Snoop stayed still. Didn't blink. Didn't move. Just waited. Because this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about making her realize she had just lost before she even knew she was playing. And from the way her lips parted slightly, from the way her fingers twitched on that clipboard, from the way the security guard stopped moving altogether, Snoop knew. She had just figured it out. And now, it was too late to take it back. The moment Snoop Dogg spoke, his voice smooth, deliberate, yet carrying the weight of something undeniable, the air inside the boutique seemed to shift, thickening like the air before a heavy storm, a pressure settling over the space that everyone in the room felt but no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. The soft background music, the kind that was meant to make people feel sophisticated and at ease while spending ridiculous amounts of money, now sounded distant, muffled, like it had been swallowed by the tension radiating from the confrontation unfolding right in the middle of the store. Every pair of eyes, hidden behind nervous glances, stolen from behind designer sunglasses, flickering from behind perfume counters, was now locked onto the scene, watching, waiting, silently assessing the situation as if they were watching a live wire sparking, unsure whether it would fizzle out quietly or explode into something much bigger. And yet, despite all the silent attention, despite all the people who knew something wasn't right, the only thing louder than the unspoken anticipation was the absolute silence of the people who could have spoken up, but didn't. The manager, still standing rigid in front of Snoop, still gripping her clipboard like it was a badge of authority rather than a prop holding up a flimsy excuse, blinked, just once, just fast enough for someone paying attention to catch the flicker of hesitation passing through her gaze. But hesitation wasn't something she could afford right now, not with the entire store watching, not after she had made such a bold, public accusation. If she backed down now, if she so much as suggested that she had misread the situation, she wouldn't just be admitting that she was wrong, she would be admitting that she had let her bias lead her into a mistake that should have never happened in the first place. So, instead of stepping back, instead of pausing to consider whether this was a battle she really wanted to fight, she doubled down. "We take theft very seriously here," she said, her tone sharper now, firmer, like she was trying to regain the control that had slipped through her fingers the second she realized who she was accusing. But Snoop. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't move. Because real power wasn't in how loud you spoke, it was in how much silence you could own. If the people watching had been torn between curiosity and discomfort before, they were now caught in something much heavier, something that had nothing to do with a store policy or a misplaced item and everything to do with the unspoken rules of power: who had it, who thought they had it, and who was about to lose it completely. A woman in a tailored white coat standing near a jewelry display shifted on her feet, her hands tightening slightly on the purse she had been admiring just moments ago. A man in an expensive suit near the leather wallet section exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw as if the tension in the room had physically reached him. Even the cashier, who had spent the last few minutes pretending to be focused on scanning a purchase, was now openly watching, her lips pressed together like she wanted to say something but hadn't quite worked up the nerve. They all felt it. The shift. The moment when the balance of control started to tilt, not toward the store manager, not toward the so-called authority figures, but toward the man who had said almost nothing and yet had already won the entire room over without lifting a single finger. At the entrance, the security guard, who had been standing just a little too still, his presence looming like a shadow waiting to be activated, cleared his throat, shifting his weight slightly, as if debating whether this was the moment he was supposed to step in. He wasn't a man who got paid to think deeply about the ethics of store policies, wasn't someone who usually questioned the calls made by management. His job was to act, to move when told, to enforce rules without letting personal opinion get in the way. But even he was hesitating now. Because he knew who Snoop Dogg was. And because deep down, he also knew this wasn't right. Snoop finally moved, not fast, not aggressively, just slowly, the kind of movement that forced people to pay attention without demanding it. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, not to check a message, not to call anyone, but simply because he could, because the very act of showing that he had nothing to hide made the accusation look even more ridiculous than it already was. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked again, his voice even smoother this time, dripping with something dangerous, not in a violent way, not in a way that threatened anything physical, but in a way that made it clear that the real damage was already being done, and it wasn't to him. The manager opened her mouth, maybe to respond, maybe to dig herself even deeper into this mess, but before she could say anything. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a mistake." It was quiet at first, but the impact was immediate. A young woman, no older than 25, stepped forward from behind the cashier's desk, her fingers fidgeting slightly as she adjusted the name tag pinned to her uniform. She looked nervous, but determined. And more importantly, she looked like she knew the truth. The manager turned sharply, her authority suddenly feeling threatened from a direction she hadn't expected. "What did you say?" The employee swallowed, took a breath, and pointed toward a glass display case a few feet away. "The missing item, it's right there," she said carefully. "It was just misplaced." The room exhaled all at once. "And the manager?" She turned pale. There were no gasps, no dramatic reactions, just an overwhelming, crushing, unforgiving silence that wrapped around the manager like a noose, like the weight of her own mistake had finally caught up with her. The security guard, who had been ready to act just moments ago, relaxed. The customers, who had been hanging on to every second of the confrontation, saw it for what it was now. And the manager? She suddenly looked very, very small. I suppose there was a misunderstanding," the manager said weakly, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I was just following protocol." Snoop chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because it was so damn predictable. Nah, he said, waving a hand, "you wasn't following protocol. You was profiling." The woman flinched. The truth had never sounded louder. Snoop didn't wait for a response. Didn't need one. He slid his shades back into place, turned slowly, and started walking toward the exit, not in defeat, not in anger, but in absolute, unshakable power. Because this wasn't a loss for him. This was a lesson she would never forget. Before he reached the door, he paused just long enough to tilt his head back slightly and say, "Next time, pick the right one." And then he was gone. The store manager, still gripping onto the thin thread of authority she had left, cleared her throat, straightened her blazer, and tried to recover from the growing weight of doubt pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about the missing item anymore, it was about control, about power, about maintaining the illusion that she had been right all along, that she hadn't just accused one of the most recognizable figures in the world of stealing in front of an entire room of people who had now gone completely silent. She adjusted the clipboard in her hands, flipping through pages she didn't really need to look at, desperately trying to mask the reality that was closing in on her from all angles. But no matter how many papers she shuffled through, no matter how straight she stood, no matter how much fake authority she tried to project, the truth was already working against her, bleeding into the cracks of her confidence like water seeping into a broken foundation. And worst of all, Snoop Dogg was still just standing there, waiting. Waiting for her to realize she had just played herself. The silence in the boutique had evolved into something heavier, something tangible, something that wrapped itself around every single person in the room like an invisible grip tightening around their throats. The customers, who had been nothing more than passive spectators a few minutes ago, now stood completely still, exchanging looks, shifting awkwardly in their places, feeling the weight of what was unfolding but unsure whether they should speak, step in, or pretend like none of it was happening. A woman near the perfume section glanced at her friend, her eyebrows raised in silent disbelief. A man in a crisp navy suit, who had been eyeing an expensive leather briefcase, now found himself rubbing his chin, his gaze flicking between Snoop and the manager, as if debating whether he should step forward and say something, but he didn't. Because that was the thing about moments like this. People always knew when something was wrong. They just rarely had the courage to do anything about it. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, when it felt like the entire boutique had become a vacuum of unspoken words and unresolved accusations, a voice finally cut through the silence, not from Snoop, not from the manager, not from the security guard who was still waiting for a reason to step forward, but from someone unexpected. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a mistake." The words came from behind the cashier counter, spoken softly at first, as if the person who said them was still debating whether they had the right to interfere. A young woman, barely in her 20s, wearing the same uniform as the other employees, had stepped forward hesitantly, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her name tag as she looked nervously between Snoop and the manager. The store manager turned sharply, her expression tightening, irritation flashing across her face. "What did you just say?" The young woman swallowed hard but stood her ground. "The missing item, it's right there," she said carefully, pointing toward a nearby display case. "It was just misplaced." And just like that, the entire weight of the accusation collapsed. For a second, just a split second, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even breathed, because the weight of what had just been revealed was too overwhelming, too crushing, too unforgivable to process all at once. The missing item, the one that had been the entire basis of this humiliating, public accusation, had never been stolen. It had never even left the store. It had just been sitting there the whole time, in plain sight, untouched, undisturbed, waiting to prove that the entire thing had been built on a lie. Snoop let out a slow breath through his nose, shaking his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smirk that wasn't amused. It was knowing, the kind of smirk that carried the weight of 1,000 moments just like this one, the kind of smirk that said I knew this was coming, and yet, it still never fails to amaze me. The security guard, who had been standing at the entrance, his body language tense and ready, suddenly relaxed. The customers, who had been frozen in suspense, now shifted uncomfortably, as if the guilt of their own silence had just come crashing down on them all at once. And the manager? The manager looked like she had just swallowed a live grenade. Her skin had gone pale, her hands tightening around the clipboard she had been gripping like a lifeline, her jaw clenched so tight that she looked like she might crack a tooth. She turned her gaze back toward Snoop, and for the first time since she had opened her mouth, she looked afraid. Not afraid of him, but afraid of the truth. Afraid of the reality that she had just publicly, loudly, and wrongfully accused Snoop Dogg of stealing in front of an entire store full of witnesses, and now, she had nowhere to hide. She cleared her throat, shifting awkwardly, desperately searching for an escape. I suppose there was a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice quieter now, suddenly devoid of all the authority it had carried just moments ago. "And Snoop?" Snoop just laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't exaggerated. It was just a slow, knowing chuckle that carried more meaning than anything else he could have said in that moment. Because what was there left to say? They had humiliated themselves. They had exposed their own bias. And now, they had to live with it. "I was just following protocol," the manager muttered weakly, trying, and failing, to save face. Snoop tilted his head slightly, slipping his shades back into place before exhaling through his nose. Nah, he said, shaking his head. "You wasn't following protocol. You was profiling." The words landed hard. Hard enough that the manager flinched. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Snoop didn't wait for a response. Didn't need one. Didn't need to argue. Didn't need to demand an apology that would never actually mean anything. He just turned, slowly, stepping past the customers who still stood frozen, past the security guard who looked like he wanted to disappear, past the manager who was now nothing more than a woman who had ruined her own reputation in the span of 5 minutes. And as he reached the exit, just before pushing open the glass doors, he paused. Just long enough to tilt his head back slightly and say, "Next time, pick the right one." And then, he was gone. The moment Snoop was out of sight, the boutique came back to life, but not in the way the manager wanted. The murmurs started first. Then the whispered criticisms. Then the side eyes directed toward the woman who had just made the biggest mistake of her professional career. And for the first time all day, she was the one being judged. Because this time, she wasn't just someone enforcing store policies. She was the villain of the story. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. The store manager stood frozen, her grip on the clipboard now weak, her confidence shattered under the weight of her own mistake. She had walked into this confrontation feeling like she had authority, like she was the one in control. But now she was just another person who had let her own assumptions make her look like a fool. Around her, the store was no longer silent, but the whispers, the exchanged glances, the quiet judgment from the customers and employees cut deeper than any words could. She had made a public scene, and now, she had to live with the fact that everyone in that boutique knew exactly what she had done. And worst of all, Snoop Dogg hadn't even needed to argue. He had just stood there and let the truth reveal itself. The security guard, who had been waiting for a reason to step in, now stood awkwardly by the entrance, realizing he had almost escalated a situation that had never even been real to begin with. The customers who had watched it all unfold suddenly pretended to be interested in the products again, as if they hadn't been hanging on to every second of the confrontation just moments ago. And the manager? She wanted to disappear. She wanted to snap her fingers and erase the last 5 minutes. But reality doesn't work like that. Reality was standing right in front of her, in the form of a store full of people who now saw her for exactly what she was. And there was no coming back from that. Snoop didn't need to stay. Didn't need an apology. Didn't need to argue with someone who had already embarrassed themselves beyond repair. So he did what real ones do, he left. As he stepped toward the door, the weight of the entire store followed him, eyes tracking his every move, knowing that he wasn't walking out in defeat, he was walking out as a man who had let the truth speak louder than anything else ever could. And just before he pushed open the door, he paused, turning his head just slightly, his voice smooth, unbothered, yet carrying the weight of something undeniable. Next time. Pick the right one. And then he was gone. The moment Snoop Dogg left, the store felt different. No one spoke to the manager. No one rushed to defend her. Because in the end, she had lost, not just the argument, not just her pride, but the respect of every single person in that boutique. And while Snoop would go about his day, unbothered, unshaken, knowing that this was just another example of why the world still had a long way to go, she would have to stand there, in the wreckage of her own making, and realize that some mistakes stay with you forever.